Welcome to the Science and Beers podcast with me, Mick Mickey. Talking science and drinking beers with researchers down at the pub. We cover a new topic each episode, so join us with a brew and let's cheers to science. This week we are getting into the very strange world of subatomic particles with physicist Astrid Eichhorn. We'll be mostly exploring quantum gravity, but we'll also be getting through other weird things happening on very small scales. Hope you enjoy. Astrid Eichhorn, thank you very much for joining me in the Science and Beers podcast. Can I get a cheers, please?
Sure.
Astrid, you have a PhD from the University of Jena. Now you are an associate professor at the CP through Origins group at the University of Southern Denmark. You have a string of awards since your PhD. You've got, for example, prizes for young researcher. You've got the teaching prizes for physics. But most notably, this year you have the Willem Young Investigator Grant, which is kind of a big deal. There was 15 researchers in all of Denmark that got that grant this year, and you were one of them. And you got it for the project probing the quantum nature of gravity. So, I would like to probe the quantum nature of gravity with you. Mm-hmm. Let's just define the quantum world. We're talking about the atom. We're talking about electrons.
We're talking, much smaller.
Much smaller
so the atom
atom
is like enormous compared to the scale of the quantum properties of space-time.
What is between the atoms? So atoms make up everything. Mm-hmm. You can't trust them. So what is in the space, say, between atoms or between the electrons that are interacting between the atoms?
Yeah, so this is where space-time itself is, right? And I mean, usually we just sort of take the existence of space and time for granted, and maybe we don't ask about its fundamental structure so much. But in the same way that atoms, or the elementary particles in atoms make up matter, we have some idea that there should be some form of fundamental structure of space-time, something that we should be able to understand, somehow the microscopic structure of that sort of fabric of our universe. And that's basically what quantum gravity is about. So it's taking the space-time from Einstein's general relativity, which allows us to understand gravity at large scales, and then it asks, well, but what is the microscopic structure of that fabric? And at that microscopic scales, quantum effects kick in and make that description of that microscale, of that microstructure, complicated.
So we're talking about the very fabric of the universe here.
Yes, exactly.
It used to be finding an atom was finding a microbe was a big deal. Finding an atom was a big deal. Mm-hmm. Finding an electron was a big deal. You go into a proton, you find quarks. That was a big deal. What you're trying to do is go even further than that and see exactly. what is in just the space between these defined things.
Yeah, so I think you can view a lot of physics as sort of the process of zooming in on nature and trying to understand it at more and more and more fundamental levels. And within the last century, we've come really far in that road, and now we're at the stage where we can sort of ask the really, really deep questions and basically try to understand what happens if we zoom in so far that, the microstructure of space-time starts to become visible, that we can sort of resolve that.
Do you have any theories or ideas, or?
Yeah, so there's a number of different theories for what that microstructure could be. So broadly defined, maybe you can think of two main ideas. One of them sort of follows this historical development that whenever one zooms into the structure of something, sort of something new emerges. Like, you zoom into the table here, you discover atoms. You zoom into atoms, you discover protons. You zoom into protons, you discover quarks. So whenever you zoom in, there's some new structure. And there's a sort of school of thought or of ideas that says, well, probably something like that is true for quantum gravity. And so string theory is something that maybe you've heard about, is basically the idea that as you zoom in further, you then discover sort of these tiny strings that make up everything, or there's other approaches called loop quantum gravity or causal sets that sort of have an idea that there is some form of atoms of space-time, just as there are atoms of matter. And then there's a different school of thought, which is basically what I'm working on, the idea that as you zoom in further, at some point, this sort of emergence of new and new structures stops, and instead what you're encountering is a new symmetry principle.
A symmetry principle?
Yes.
Okay. Could you elaborate?
Yes. Yeah. So symmetries are always quite powerful, right? They allow us to reconstruct a full object by just looking at a part of it. Like, for instance, if you take a butterfly, just look at its left half. By symmetry, you know what the right half looks like. Or you take a sunflower, and by just looking at a part of it, using then a rotational symmetry, you can reconstruct the rest. And so this idea of space-time having a new symmetry is that the symmetry is scale symmetry. That's a symmetry where things just look the same if you zoom in further and further. So it's something that is sort of self-similar or fractal like.
Yeah, like some crazy psychedelic fractals. You
Yes.
just keep zooming in and zooming in, zooming in, and
Exactly.
then you get stuck in a loop.
Yeah, and sort of that powerful symmetry principle is one of the ideas of what sort of could happen once you zoom into space-time really, really far, that there are no new structures that emerge, but instead it's this sort of self-similarity or this new symmetry that then shows up.
And somehow these can I call them fractals?
Yeah, I would say fractal-like, but yeah.
Fractal-like symmetry things, they're holding space and time together.
Yeah, they are sort of describing the microstructure. So they sort of give an answer to the question, what do we see as we zoom in further? How many sort of new layers of new stuff should we expect to emerge? And the answer is none. At some point you just hit this sort of self-similarity, this sort of fractal-like thing, and then you can zoom in arbitrarily far and you will always sort of see the same type of thing. Mm-hmm. So that sort of stops this, sequence of new stuff emerging whenever you zoom in more.
One of the things that freaked me out about quantum mechanics is they say things can spring in and out of existence. It can be there and then it disappears and then it just comes back in again. Mm-hmm. Like I think electrons can do this.
Yeah, they can sort of, I wouldn't say they go in and out of existence necessarily. It depends on what exactly you're talking about. Mm-hmm. There is this property of elementary particles that because of quantum fluctuations, the vacuum, which you think of as just being empty space and nothing, is in fact sort of filled with sort of virtual particles that just exist for like short moments of time. And this really sort of changes the vacuum in the quantum world to compare to our sort of classical and naive expectation. And that certainly creates one of the big challenges of quantum field theory, but what allows us to understand the other fundamental forces. The framework of quantum field theory is the mathematical framework in which we describe these forces. And one of the properties that shows up in there is this consequence of quantum effects, these vacuum fluctuations of particles sort of showing up and disappearing again, and changing the vacuum into something that is not just empty space.
Can we talk about some of the more known weird things in the quantum world?
Sure.
Like, for example, quantum entanglement.
Mm-hmm.
Quantum entanglement, as far as I know, you can have two electrons that are paired and they kind of like mimic each other. And then you can put several kilometers in between them. Mm-hmm. And then if you change the principal of one, the other one immediately changes.
Yes.
How are they connected through this fabric of space-time?
That's a great question. So I don't think we sort of understand entanglement really completely. There's a mathematical formalism which basically says the two of them go into one common state, so that no matter how far you pull them apart, they are nevertheless one joint system. And so therefore one of the components, if you change that, the other will always know about that. But I don't think we have like a very, very deep fundamental understanding of what that actually does to space-time. So this would be one of the questions that a quantum theory of gravity would allow us to answer. So it would go beyond describing this system of entangled particles on a classical spacetime and would tell us what happens to spacetime itself. Can we have sort of entanglement of spacetime, or how does spacetime react to this system of entangled particles sitting on top of it? So that's one of the open questions.
Is gravity, in any sense of the word, involved in something like that, in quantum entanglement?
So not in the systems that are currently built experimentally, simply because the gravitational effects in those systems are just too weak. So basically because an electron is like extremely light. And so in these experiments, the gravitational force basically doesn't play a role.
Can we talk a bit about the Higgs boson?
Sure.
That was discovered, it was predicted years ago, and it was discovered at CERN, the Large Hadron Collider. And another fantastic example about scientific theory and predictions eventually being proven experimentally. And I understand it was a major discovery, but
it was certainly a big deal.
Understanding it was quite challenging. Could you try to help me with that?
Basically it's about the question why the elementary particles that we know, why they are massive, why they aren't massless. So
why they have mass,
yes,
or don't.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. So that in principle you can have both kinds. You can have, for instance, the photon, the particle that is associated to light. That is a massless particle. It travels at the speed of light. And then you have stuff like the quarks and the electron that make up atoms and make up us, that are massive. And the question is what makes them massive? Where do they take the mass from? And the Higgs boson is basically a new form of interaction that interacts with the electron, it interacts with the quarks, and through that interaction it sort of slows these particles down. So if you switch off the Higgs boson, then everything would just travel at the speed of light. And because these particles interact with the Higgs boson, or actually with the Higgs field that is associated to that, these interactions sort of slow these particles down, and this is what makes them massive. And different elementary particles interact with the Higgs to sort of different extents. And the more they interact, the more massive they become.
That's the part that I didn't quite get, because it was the Higgs physical particle that was discovered, but yet it's the Higgs field. So in my mind, it's nothing physical. It's some kind of like another force with space and time, and then you have the Higgs field. I don't really understand how that works.
So this is because in the quantum understanding of forces, forces are associated to fields on the one side, but they are all associated to particles. So every field can have sort of excitations, like a little sort of extra energy in the field at a certain point. And this is what we then associate to particles. So for instance, the electromagnetic force comes with its particle, the photon. Then in an atomic, in a nucleus, in a proton, we have the strong force that keeps the quarks bound together so that they form protons. And that strong force is associated to its own particle, the gluon. And in a similar way, you then have the Higgs field, and it's the sort of extra force or interaction that gives masses to the particles. But then it can also have these sort of excitations, these little sort of extra packets of energy, which we associate with particles, and this is the Higgs boson. And so this is then what you can see in a particle detector. It's sort of the particle that is associated with the field. But the field is the one that is sort of fundamentally important to generate the masses.
And does this Higgs field, are you incorporating this field into your own work and trying to discover or find out quantum gravity?
Yes.
Find out the nature of quantum gravity, you mean?
Yeah. So maybe one of the things that sort of distinguishes what my research group does from many other research groups is that we try to think about the nature of space and time at the same time as we think about the nature of elementary particles. So a lot of research typically focuses on either one of the questions. So it either tries to understand elementary particles better, or it tries to understand the microscopic structure of space and time. What we are saying is sort of that you can't understand one without the other. Elementary particles are influenced by their environment, which is space-time, sort of like an animal species is influenced by the environment that it lives in. And on the other hand, that animal species also influences its environment. And in the same way, elementary particles, again, sort of shape what happens to the microstructure of space and time. And so the work that we are pursuing is trying to understand the microstructure of space-time together with the structure of elementary particles. And so the Higgs field is therefore one of those fields that we are trying to take into account and try to understand what is the sort of interplay between the Higgs field and space-time, or the fundamental fabric of space-time.
Doesn't sound like a trivial task to me.
No, definitely not.
Yeah. And so your group would be working like theoretically
yes.
with that.
Yeah.
So another thing that is inherent to us is time, the forward movement of time. Mm-hmm. And you mentioned everything that we hold true is based on the structures of the universe, which is related to space and time. Does time work in the quantum world in anything that we can relate to? Does time move forward in the quantum world?
Yes, time always moves forward, but we don't actually really understand why. So most of the laws of physics are actually symmetric. If you would have a universe that goes backward, where everything sort of moves backward in time, that would be the same laws of physics as where things move forward in time. Mm. And so understanding why only one of those is actually realized, so where this, what is called arrow of time that only points towards the future, where that comes from is also an open question, actually. Or similarly, you could also ask things like, well, why do we actually have 3 dimensions of space and 1 of time? Why do we not live in a universe which has 2 directions of time? Mm-hmm. Which would obviously completely change physics and our everyday experience. But so all of these are very fundamental questions that we don't have any answers to. So we just observe that there's 1 direction of time, it always goes forward, 3 directions of space, but we don't actually understand why.
Does any of your work look towards, say, the beginning of the universe to explain why the universe is as it is today? Maybe some things could have been tweaked at the start, and then maybe we'll have an extra dimension of time.
Yeah, so that's a great question. So the theory of quantum gravity that we don't have yet would be necessary to understand the universe in its very beginning, simply because, if you follow the evolution of the universe sort of back to its infancy, it all started out in what we call the Big Bang, when everything was basically squashed together in like a very, very small region of space-time. And in that regime, quantum gravity would be important. But since we don't have that theory yet, we can't explain or we can't describe the sort of the birth of the universe. There's different ideas for what could have happened.
So you just said everything was concentrated in a so everything that we see in the universe today was concentrated in this very, very small thing. Something that on quantum scales.
Yes.
So everything in the universe was
on extremely tiny scales.
Was extremely tiny. Yeah.
Yeah.
So then you would think gravity exists in the world today. Gravity must have been there just that split second after the Big Bang. Yes,
and somehow, everything came from this like very, very tiny space-time region where you sort of would have seen the fundamental fabric of space and time itself directly. So if we were able to sort of, go back and observe that initial beginning, we would directly see quantum gravity at work.
I've got a little bit of a mind thing going on here. You were talking about fractals earlier on, so if we take this whole universe and we zoom it down, we're going into that quantum world, and then we keep going, and then you're stuck in that world of fractals. You're maybe stuck in this kind of am I on something psychedelic right now, or am I stuck in some kind of
Yeah,
fractal loop.
I think you're basically asking the question, where did this Big Bang come from?
Yes.
Like, once we sort of, we follow the evolution of the universe backwards to its very infancy, at some point we get to this point where quantum gravity would have kicked in. And then, the question is, what was there before? What was the universe like before in this quantum world? Did it actually exist for a very long time, just in a sort of crazy quantum gravity form of way? Or did it really start at this very beginning? Or was there like a big universe before that collapsed and then went through a quantum gravitational phase and then produced the Big Bang? We just don't know that. So there's different theories around that, but we don't have an answer yet.
I watched a YouTube thing, but it was narrated by some physicists, Brian Cox being one, and it was about the future of the universe, and it went trillions and trillions and trillions and trillions of years into the future. Eventually, black holes are going to consume everything, and then the black holes are going to consume each other. And then there's just going to be one big black hole with everything kind of concentrated in it. And then they didn't quite say, but it kind of suggested to the viewer that once the last black hole consumes everything and everything's in there and it's so compressed in little tiny space, like a quantum thing, boom, the universe comes, the Big Bang comes again. So it kind of didn't say, but it suggested that the universe lasts trillions and trillions and trillions of years, and then it consumes itself, and then it explodes again.
So we don't actually know whether that could happen or not, because we don't understand the center of black holes yet. In the very, very center of black holes, effects of quantum gravity would become so large that definitely the description of classical general relativity breaks down. And so this means that, these objects that we observe, where, last year the Event Horizon Telescope recorded this very first image, we can now see the shadows of black holes, but we don't understand these objects sort of fundamentally. We don't really know what their center looks like. And so therefore we don't really know what ultimately happens to things that fall in there. And also this means we don't understand the end of the lives of black holes. So black holes, they emit what is known as Hawking radiation, which means that they very, very, very slowly evaporate. And at some point they become small enough so that the quantum gravity effect in its center really dominates what the whole black hole does. And at that point we just don't know what the end of the life history of a black hole is. Mm-hmm. Does it exist in some form of quantum gravity state forever? Does it just evaporate completely? Mm-hmm. We don't know yet. And so I would say that this idea that, the whole universe is eaten up by black holes, and then something happens once there's just one of them left. That is definitely a fascinating speculation. But in order to be able to say something more definite about it, again, we would actually need to understand space-time at its microscopic level, at these smallest possible scales.
But not just the space-time, but in the center of a black
exactly.
hole. Just to confirm that what a black hole is, it's a supermassive black star that collapsed in on itself.
That's one way to make black holes. Mm-hmm. What a black hole is characterized by is really that it's sort of a wall to information, in the sense that stuff can, it's a wall that is one-sided, so stuff can fall in, but nothing can go out of a black hole.
So a black hole is the ultimate gravity heavyweight. Yeah. It's so dense. Or there's so much gravity going on that nothing can escape.
Yes, yeah. So the space-time of curvature, the curvature of space-time becomes so extreme that it pulls light, so even light can't escape, and anything other than, nothing can go faster than light, so anything other can also not escape. So you can build the most powerful rocket, you will not be able to escape from a black hole. So it's really a region where gravity becomes much stronger than the gravity that we know on the surface of the Earth, where we can have apples fall and so on.
And it bends space-time that much because of the high concentration of quantum particles that give gravity.
It doesn't have to be quantum particles, but so any form of energy and matter, if you compress it enough, it will make space-time curvature larger and larger. So for instance, just as a thought experiment, if you take Earth and you could compress all of Earth's mass into a marble of 1 centimeter, that this is where Earth would then turn into a black hole. So this gives you maybe an idea of like how extreme these objects are. The sort of the extremes of density that you would have to reach.
And because of the difference in the gravity, which would be the bending of space and time, if we go close to something of very concentrated gravity or high gravity, our own time slows down, is that right?
Yes.
According to the movie Interstellar?
Yeah, so that's actually an effect that already kicks in on Earth. So whenever you have anything that exerts gravitational force, on the surface of the Earth, time goes a little slower than it goes if you're a satellite. And so the GPS satellites, they actually have to take this into account. So this is a very subtle effect, actually, from general relativity. If you neglect it, then the GPS satellites will be off after a while. So this fact that that on the surface of the Earth, time goes a little slower due to this curvature of space-time effect, that is something that really affects everyday technology.
Okay. Well, that's an application there of quantum physics.
It's not of quantum physics, though. It's just of general relativity.
Einstein's equations from 100 years ago.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Without him, we wouldn't be able to use our Google Maps or...
Yeah, I think without him, we would have, assuming we wouldn't have known about general relativity, we would have then realized that something is off as we had sent up the GPS satellites. After a few days, they would just, provide us with wrong positions. And then we would have realized, okay, there's something more going on. So there's maybe this alternative history of physics where, GR gets discovered by sending up the GPS satellites and then realizing there's some aspect that we're missing.
But he managed to do it just by thinking about it.
Yeah, exactly.
That is impressive.
Yeah.
Are you aware of any other applications of, say... Well, no, sorry, that was general relativity.
Mm-hmm.
But applications of quantum theory in everyday life.
There's lots. I mean, so the whole understanding of modern electronics that we have, of semiconductors, that is all based on quantum physics. Basically, whenever you use anything that has a processor in it,
my phone.
Yeah, your phone. All of that modern electronics is based on quantum physics. Another great example is solar cells. That's an effect from quantum physics that it uses. And so maybe one of the things to emphasize in that context, since we are facing all of these grand challenges to solve climate change, hunger, health problems, and so on. There's always this reflex to focus more on applied research, where you can see that somebody is working directly on solving one of these grand challenges. But these examples from quantum physics, or also the example from general relativity, shows you that very often some very basic and foundational research, where the researchers were definitely not thinking about any of these applications, then turns out to really be a driver of technology and of solutions tomorrow. So I think this is an important historical lesson to keep in mind nowadays when there are political discussions as to what type of research should one be funding and what shouldn't one be funding.
Well, I think it's incredibly important to find out what is the universe. What is this thing that we're experiencing?
Yeah.
So like the fact that you're looking into the nature of quantum gravity, that's a fantastic thing. So
yeah, well, I think it's something that maybe defines us as humans, that we've always wanted to understand our world, right? And I mean, obviously our possibilities, our technological opportunities have advanced, and we can now ask these questions maybe in a more elaborate way than we were able to ask them 10,000 years ago when we were sitting in front of caves and staring up at the night sky. But like fundamentally, I think we are always still asking the same questions, just sort of what is this universe around us like? What is it made of? Mm-hmm. It's I think the questions that really sort of define us as humans in some way.
How did you get into this, Astrid? How did you get inspired to pursue a career in physics?
Well, basically, by this ability to just ask really fundamental questions and to really understand something, as fundamentally and as deeply as possible. And I have to say, I had a great physics teacher in grades 12 and 13. So before that, I actually wasn't that much into physics. Before that, physics at school was basically a lot of electronics that I was not fascinated by. And then I just had a great physics teacher who showed me that physics actually is about asking all of these fundamental questions. And then in a very short time, I decided that that's what I actually want to do.
And was it always focused in the quantum world?
Yeah, it was always focused very much on questions of either very big or very small. Mm-hmm. So questions like from astronomy, from astrophysics, so the universe as a whole. And on the other hand, questions in elementary particle physics, sort of the very small, so like the universe as a whole and its fundamental building blocks. So both of these areas are what always fascinated me most.
So whenever I was studying physics, I was also perplexed at some of the things we were learning in class. So there's this thing that a lot of physics students would have done, the double slit experiment. Mm-hmm. Maybe you want to explain it, actually.
Sure. Well, so the double slit experiment is something that you can easily think about with waves. You can even think about ocean waves. Imagine you put a wall into the ocean, and then waves crash into it, and then you put two openings into it, and then the waves can pass through. And then you will see that behind the wall, when the waves meet again, they will form a sort of non-trivial pattern. And that's what it's then called an interference pattern. So the two waves coming from these two openings, they interfere with each other. And then you can do the same thing with light, because there's also a wave. And one of the really surprising things about quantum mechanics is that you can then do the same thing with objects that we think of as particles. For instance, you can do this experiment with electrons.
You fire an electron at one slit, and it goes through that slit and out the other side.
Yes.
And if you fire it at two slits, it goes through both slits.
Yeah. So it behaves as if it was a wave that passes through both slits at the same time, and then interferes with itself. And so the position that it then ends up behind the wall is not the position that you would get if it would just sort of straightforwardly go through any one of the two slits, just like a classical football would do. Instead, it ends up somewhere where you can only describe how it ended up there because it behaved like a wave while it was passing through the two slits.
So it collapses from a particle to a wave when presented with an option.
Yeah, it sort of moves as if it was a wave. And whenever it interacts with something, it goes back to its particle nature. So when it hits a wall in the back, or a detector, it behaves like a particle. So you see it as a point on the screen. But when it moves, when it propagates, then it behaves like a wave.
So there was something about, if you have, say, an electron, then you have those two slits. But if you have a detector behind just one of the slits, it will always go through just one slit. If you take the detector away, it will collapse into a wave until it hits the detector further back. Mm-hmm. It almost as if the subatomic particle knows that it's going to be observed at the other side of the two slits.
Yeah, it's because the observation process is an interaction. So whenever you observe something, you interact with it in some way. So in the classical world, we don't think about that so much, but I mean, whenever we observe something, that typically involves light, right? So that involves actually light bouncing off an object and then making it into our screen, our screen that we have, or making it into our eyes. So it's an interaction that is taking place. And the thing with the quantum world is that these interactions then have a big impact on the objects that we are observing, and that's what one sees with the double slit experiment. When one puts a detector behind one of the slits, that interacts with the particle, and whenever there is an interaction, that has a big impact on the particle. So it completely changes the setup for the particle.
I've got a big problem with that. I don't understand that. I don't see how this interaction can change the properties, because the electron's approaching the two slits, and it shouldn't matter what's going to happen in the future, what it does currently.
Mm-hmm.
But what will happen in the future does change what it does currently, and that's the choice to go through either slit.
So it's not something that necessarily needs you to sort of have the future impact the past. It's at the moment when the electron arrives at the slits and interacts with the detector. At that moment, things change. And then the particle collapses back to its particle nature. So the particle doesn't need to know that there will be a detector. So up to the point where it reaches the two slits, it behaves in the same way for both setups. Mm-hmm. But then the measurement process, when that happens, that changes the setup.
How does that interaction change the outcome?
So any interaction, or most interactions actually lead to the wave that describes the particle collapsing back to just one particular location. Mm-hmm. And so when there is this detector between one of the slits, that changes the wave nature back to the particle nature. Mm-hmm.
I still don't get that. But where I was going with it anyway was the way I read it was that conscious observation can change the properties of.
Yeah, I don't think consciousness is involved in that, because the same thing happens if you just, if you put a detector and you don't have an experimentalist sitting there and observing it. You just have, let's say, a laptop recording the results. Mm-hmm. So it's not that the conscious observation is what changes. It's really just the interaction of the particle with the detector.
So there's another example I'll give you. I believe it's called the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. Mm-hmm. There's electrons spinning around an atom, or a nucleus, and you can see its momentum or its speed, but you can't see its position. Or you can see its position, but you won't be able to see its speed. So we're unable to just observe subatomic particles in a way that's rational to me. Why can we measure one thing and not the other at the same time?
It has to do with the fact that fundamentally the particle isn't really a particle like a sort of tiny version of a football or something like that. But it has this dual nature of like being a particle but also a wave. And so a wave has this property that is, for instance, spread out in space. So when the wave might be going in a particular direction, but you can't really say the wave is exactly here. It's sort of a thing that is spread out. And because of this wave-like nature that particles also have, one of the consequences of that is the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. And yeah, I agree. It's always completely unintuitive, and I think it takes everybody a while to sort of get used to those properties. I don't think physicists necessarily really understand what goes on in quantum physics. We just get used to the fact that that's the way it is. And it's just because it's so different from our sort of everyday experience that we are finding that very unintuitive.
Is it because our brains were evolved to survive the savannah?
Yes, maybe. I mean, in the savannah, you don't need to sort of understand, the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. It's irrelevant. You need a brain that is, quick to react to, things as they are in sort of in the world at the sort of, human scale. And so we just have our intuition sort of honed on that scale. And it doesn't work so well when we go to much, much bigger scales, like the whole, the universe as a whole, or much, much smaller scales. Mm-hmm. I would imagine if we were sort of, quantum beings and live our everyday life in like a quantum world, then we would find that completely intuitive. And we would be very puzzled by like a classical world where somebody says like, oh, you can measure the position and the velocity of the football at the same time. I think we would find that very puzzling.
But it's still quite extraordinary that a mind was, essentially evolved to evade a saber-toothed tiger. It was able to contemplate the entirety of the universe.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. Yeah. So certainly, I mean, the brain is certainly a totally amazing thing.
And you're using it. Cheers to that.
Cheers.
Okay. I don't know. You seem very, very sure of these things.
Well, I mean, for a lot of these things, we are pretty sure because we have, a mathematical framework that allows us to understand these things very precisely, right? I mean, so math is like a much more precise version of language.
Is that the tool that you're using to address your questions about quantum gravity?
Yes.
Pure mathematics.
Yes, any physical theory is mathematics, with an interpretation, obviously. And then, of course, I mean, with all of these quantum properties of elementary particles, they have been very, very well tested in like many, many, many experiments. And so this is why we are pretty sure, how these things work. We are not so sure then if we go into the quantum gravity regime, because there we can formulate mathematical theories, but we don't have experiments to decide which of these alternative which of these alternative theories, all of which are sort of mathematically viable, which of those is sort of the one that nature chose to realize. And that's different if we're talking about quantum properties of elementary particles. We have a mathematical theory for that, but also, most importantly, we have experiment, and they go hand in hand and confirm each other. And so we then have a good understanding of what happens in these systems.
And even how wild the theory might sound, it's first proposed mathematically, and then it is realized experimentally. And some of the quantum experiments are the most precise experiments that we have. It doesn't make any sense, but it works, and the theories hold true.
Yeah, that's I guess kind of how it works, right? I mean, so the question whether or not something conforms to human intuition is not a way to decide whether it's a correct description of nature, right? I mean, so nature doesn't need to behave in a way that makes sense for us. So as long as we have a mathematical understanding that is mathematically correct, and then we can make predictions based on that come out right, then that is a viable model of nature.
I can't let you go without touching on some controversial theories, if
Sure.
you don't mind. So there's a couple of theories that are gaining weight, I think, and one of them is called panpsychism, and the other is called biocentrism. So panpsychism is the theory that consciousness is something that everything has. This glass holding my beer, and there's just varying degrees of it, and so it describes consciousness as a force of nature that connects everything. Before you talk about that, I'm going to say about biocentrism, which was invented by a biologist, Robert Lanza, that puts biology at the forefront of physics, and talks about consciousness is like a necessity for understanding the universe, or as Carl Sagan says, we are the way for the cosmos to know itself. They kind of lead to the suggestion that our very conscious observation of the universe is a necessity in the universe.
I think those are all great questions, and they really sort of show how little we understand about the world that we live in, right? So we've really just sort of scratched the surface of understanding the universe. So I think understanding consciousness is obviously big and as yet unreached goal of neuroscience, and I think there's definitely exciting things to understand there. I'm not sure whether it will be another force of nature. I mean, at the moment, there's certainly nothing in physical theories that would, suggest that we would need to include a force like that. But obviously, we don't understand consciousness yet, so we can't really say.
Well, I wanted to bring that up with an actual quantum physicist here, but yeah, so. It's not part of your list of fundamental universal forces.
No, it's not. But I can't exclude for sure that that in the future it might not become. I mean, I personally would be skeptical about that, simply because I don't see any indications that would be a necessity. But obviously, I can't exclude it for sure.
Well, in their arguments, they were using some of the things we talked about earlier on, which the observation changes the properties of subatomic particles.
but as I said, it doesn't have to be an observation that includes consciousness. So it can just be an observation that is really just, the interaction of different physical objects with each other. And so therefore, I think, there's no necessity to include consciousness in order to understand the fundamental physical world.
Well, that was some pretty tough topics there. I still don't feel that I have. Well, there is no answer to quantum gravity, so I shouldn't feel bad that I don't understand it.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's basically what to varying degrees everybody in the quantum gravity community feels.
Yes.
Maybe part of the community feels they are closer to an answer than other parts, but none of us knows or feels that they know what quantum gravity is.
Mm-hmm. Can you describe how do you collaborate with other people? Do you bounce ideas off each other? How do you negotiate all these different theories of quantum gravity?
In quantum gravity, because we don't really have experiments that help us, there's various camps that develop different theories, and to some extent those camps then have become a little entrenched, and little sort of local disputes, or I wouldn't call them wars, but sort of conflicts broke out, and one of the things that maybe a sort of a newer generation of researchers is currently trying to establish in the quantum gravity community is this idea that we really need diversity of ideas and viewpoints in order to make progress on these tough questions. So theories like, for instance, loop quantum gravity or string theory have been developed for 30, 40 years, and none of them has yet reached a point where we say, oh, it's actually a satisfactory theory and it really makes full sense and so on. And so maybe we have reached a point where we need to go, beyond these entrenched camps and have the realization that by bringing various viewpoints together, this is how we can really make progress. And I think this is maybe something that is important for science as a whole. That that diversity of ideas is really something that we need. In contrast to just following the same type of ideas with the same type of people. I don't think this is the type of thinking that will solve any of the big problems, be that quantum gravity or any of the more applied problems.
So it's collaboration, international collaboration, and
yes.
working together to
but also appreciating people coming with out of the box ideas and really coming from a completely different perspective that very much challenges what one is used to thinking. That's important, even though that's sort of an unpleasant process to go through when somebody shows up and challenges all your ideas and questions everything. That's really a necessity to make progress.
So what's next, Astrid? You got this grant from the Willem Fund. You're making a team to figure out the nature of quantum gravity. Can you tell me what does the future hold for you?
Yeah, so the future holds a bunch of to me very exciting questions. I don't think we will figure out the nature of quantum gravity, but hopefully we'll make like a few steps in that direction. One of those steps is maybe more abstract. It has to do with the fact that we want to understand the microscopic structure of space and time, whereas until now we have focused more on just understanding the fundamental nature of space, and the presence of time really focuses it constitutes a big riddle that we are trying to tackle next. The other sort of big exciting question is to understand how dark matter fits into this whole picture. So I've said before that we focus on the interplay of space-time and of matter, and obviously dark matter is this big not understood component of the universe, some form of matter that we don't understand yet, and we want to understand whether by putting it into this common picture with space-time and matter, whether this allows us to understand a little bit more what dark matter could be. And in order to tackle these questions, I'm bringing in new team members. International team members, so all of this is a very international effort, and we'll have a student and a PhD student and a postdoc joining us from Brazil, hopefully soon. Okay,
can you tell us a little bit about dark matter, just to give us an idea?
Sure. The fact that there is dark matter is something that was first observed by Vera Rubin. She was looking at how galaxies rotate around their centers. And she discovered that they were actually going way too fast. From what you see, a galaxy should just instantly fly apart because the outer parts just rotate way too quickly. And so from that, one infers that there has to be way more matter than what we see in the stars that holds the galaxy together. And we don't really understand at all what it is. And so that's why it's called dark matter. What we are trying to do in my team is to take a sort of really fundamental perspective on that and try to understand, well, at the most fundamental level, if we try to put this into a common framework with the microstructure of space-time, does this somehow restrict what the properties of dark matter could be? Does this somehow allow us to narrow down the possible choices of what type of particle dark matter could be?
Okay, we don't know what it is, but it sure has some gravity.
It definitely has some gravity. That's one thing that we know for sure, and it doesn't emit any light. That are the two things that we know. Nice.
Well, good luck.
Thank you
for you and your team.
Thanks.
And whenever maybe we can check in again.
Yeah.
And see how close we are to understanding the quantum nature of gravity. Astrid Akon, thank you very much for joining me on the Science and Beers podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Cheers to science.
Cheers to science.
I hope your brain didn't hurt as much as mine whilst thinking about what is in the space between electrons. But it was fun to imagine anyway. So we'll be keeping an eye on Astrid's work to see if we're getting any closer to understanding the nature of quantum gravity. Please consider supporting this podcast. You can do that at patreon.com/science and beers. Thanks for listening.